Alrighty. Good afternoon. My name is Haleigh Horan, and today I am joined with Mr. Joseph Scaramucci. And on behalf of the Inn Network, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today about your career and the future of national security. So, to start off, would you mind providing the listeners with a brief overview of your background, such as how you got here, the various roles you've held, and then we can delve further into certain aspects as we continue through the podcast?
Yeah, for sure. So, been law enforcement for uh I hate to say it, 22 years now. Worked full time for a sheriff's office. Was in investigations for the overwhelming majority of my career. Did kind of we were a multifaceted department, right? So for a large chunk of what I did death investigations, sex crime investigations, violent crime. Um, Kind of found my way into human trafficking by accident. So for about the last, I don't know, 9 years of full-time employment there, I was assigned as a human trafficking child exploitation investigator. Was a task force officer with Homeland Security for the majority of that time as well. Um, kind of in addition, we were a multi kind of use department, right? So I did 13 years in SWAT, both entry and as a sniper, and then about the same in aviation unit as well. So um, I was a glutton for punishment when it called out.
Yeah, to go a little further, I wanted to know like what specifically led you to law enforcement in 2004. Um, and yeah,
Honestly, I was coming out of the Marine Corps and was looking for a career. Didn't Law enforcement probably would have been the last one I would have ever imagined. I knew I wanted to do public service of some sort. To be honest, I kind of thought about the fire service. And I had been hanging around some cops, as some of my running buddies were law enforcement, and I thought, man, I wouldn't mind going to work with these guys. So it's kind of how it happened. It's the most, non-romantic, like, oh my God, I wanted to, save babies and do all that. Yeah, it just kind of fell into place. And there I was, working midnights.
nice. So you said that you worked with the Crimes Against Persons unit.
Yeah.
You assigned to that unit when you joined the law enforcement, or did you decide yourself that you wanted to pursue a career in that unit?
Yeah, so I actually did about 2 years on the street and patrol, so not a lot of patrol time. Well, 4 years total. Um, the first chief of police I had, it was funny. I was a young cop, and I want to go to SWAT school. I want to do this. I want to do that. And it was all this like high speed, low drag stuff. And he started sending me to investigative schools. And I wasn't thrilled, right? So he's like, hey, there's this class to become a handwriting expert, and I'm like, who wants to do this? So I was doing these investigative classes, and I was really blessed. I didn't realize it at the time, but it kind of set my career up, and that's what he was doing, right? So when I went to the sheriff's office, I was actually hired at the county straight into investigations because of my background. And yeah, I kind of by chance there was a spot that was opened doing crimes against people, and I'd always had an interest in kind of death investigations. I thought it was kind of the pinnacle of people's career, right? Like being able to work a homicide is an extremely important job, and there's just so much responsibility that I think comes with that. So I kind of felt like, hey, I hit that pinnacle, right? And then from there, naturally, because it was something that I did. I just kind of got deeper and deeper, right? I want to go to crime scene reconstruction. I want to go to fire school, right? If I have burned bodies, I want to know how fire works. Um, I want to do bloodstain pattern analysis and fingerprint comparison, process my own, just tons and tons of things. And ultimately, what it did was it secured my position, right? So it put me in a position where I had just very, very extensive training in evidence processing and crime scene reconstruction and all of those things that um, I spent, better half of a career doing that. And again, I absolutely loved it.
Wow. It's kind of crazy to think about how many different facets fit into, investigating a crime scene.
There are,
Yeah.
and unfortunately, none of which are like smart to just get involved in. We always say like somebody was a jack of all trades and a master of none. But when you decide, hey, I have this burned body as an example, I need to become an origin and cause investigator to find out how fire works. What you don't anticipate is that now you'll get the house fire cases being assigned to you because you're the only fire guy. So some of them are great and wonderful. Some of them were I probably should have ran the other direction instead of trying to immerse myself in it. But yeah, there's so many different facets of just a death investigation that we don't realize because a lot of agencies specialize in very, very narrow things, right? Like you are the fingerprint guy, you are the fingerprint comparison gal, you are the bloodstain pattern analysis, and
Mhm.
it's great, but I don't think it makes you a well-rounded investigator, right? I want to know what I'm looking at myself,
Right.
just have an idea.
Right. Yeah. One of the internships I had previously, we had to go out to a house fire and they were showing us how they could determine where it started. And I was like, oh,
Yeah.
I didn't really know. I mean, obviously, I know that there's always an origin, but
Yeah.
how they find it is kind of really interesting. And so going off of that, you discussed how you were interested in human trafficking and you got into that. I
Yeah.
believe it was in 2014 you created the human trafficking unit. I kind of wanted to know, did you experience any issues in creating that unit when it like was established or as time evolved? And how did you work through those challenges yourself and with your team?
Yeah, so when we first started doing these operations and investigations, it was me and my partner at the time were the ones that were kind of tasked with doing this. Um, we were building the plane as we flew, right? We had no idea what we were doing. To be honest with you, I thought it was such a transnational issue that I didn't anticipate it even becoming more than an occasional sting operation. Um, the issues we had initially were kind of interesting. It was being double tasked, right? So at the time, I would be working a case and I would have to go to Arkansas as an example. I can think of one time, and you're working out of state and you get a call of a death, or you get a call of something that you have to try to figure out how to get home to be able to work this case. And it pretty quickly, I want to say within a year, it was like, hey, we cannot do both. Like,
Hmm.
you have to decide. It was an administrative question that we went to. We presented all the numbers and just said, you have to decide what you want. I had a very, very supportive administration. I had a phenomenal administration. And I went to them. I said, here's the numbers. This is over the last year what we've accomplished within trafficking. I want to do this. I don't want to do deaths anymore. I want to work this. And here's the justification. And
Hmm.
I mean, the boss looked at it and there was no hesitation. He's like, yeah, do it. Um, couple of the bigger issues we had kind of beyond that were convincing some people that there was a problem, right? We still see this you see it all the time. It's like, oh, well, we don't really mess with the prostitutes. And you're like, well, that's definitely not what this is, right? We're talking about human trafficking. We're not talking about that.
Right.
Um, so getting buy-in could there was a little bit of difficulty, but not much. The beauty was it was more like parallel. It wasn't administration. Like my administration was bought in. It was the people around you from time to time that were like, oh, this is this is such a waste, and you're like, well, but is it?
Hmm.
Um, and then the biggest kind of change for me that I saw was as we were figuring this out, we realized that, you know, at the time, the norm was to arrest a bunch of women for prostitution, call it a human trafficking investigation, and move on. And as we were pushing back on that and going, hey, this doesn't seem right. A, we're not arresting traffickers. B, these women are victimized and we're criminalizing them. When we stopped doing that and when we started encouraging other people not to do that, there was pushback, right? Because it was not a law enforcement norm. It was not really accepted. It was, very much like, oh, well, these people are committing crime. And you have to ask yourself, like, but are they? Are they really?
Right.
Um, and you throw ego in there, and that's the way we've always done it. And it could, leads to friction from time to time, but those really were just the only kind of small issues we had.
It's interesting that you say that it was more criminalizing for women rather than actually advocating to say,
Yeah,
hey, this is a serious situation. And I think that's arisen in numerous different ways in different
yeah.
parts of history. Um, so, you started the unit in 2014. When was it kind of that you were taking that step back to be like, no, I don't necessarily think it's more criminal matters, it's more investigative, that we should take it in that direction. What year
Yeah.
was that in, do you know?
Yeah, it was about 2016. So I know that I had completely stopped arresting for women for the offense of prostitution by 2017. Um, what we were finding and what was happening, and it still happens, right, is that, we would sit down with these women and we would ask, like, hey, are you being sex trafficked? And they would say no, and we're like, well, okay, then, you're clearly committing crime, you go to jail. Um, and what we were watching was these women that were like, no, I'm not being trafficked. Like that guy that dropped me off, he's my friend. Um, and then the friend would show up again, and again, and then the friend would bond them out of jail, and the friend would do all these things, and you're looking at it and you're like, I'm not the smartest guy in the world by any stretch, but this just doesn't seem right, and you start kind of digging on it. And you're like, wait a minute, there's more to this.
Hmm.
So what we really did was started applying the investigative methodologies of homicides to
Hmm.
these cases, right? So we walked in with the assumption that every woman that walks in the door is going to tell us they're not being trafficked, right? Which was a safe one. And what we started kind of mentally pretending was the moment they knocked on our hotel door, they just no longer existed, right? Like, can I build this case without your help? And that's where a little bit of arrogance comes in, right? Because I'm like, I did it on homicides every day. Never
What?
had a homicide
Yeah.
victim tell me who shot him. Not once, right? So it was like, how do we do this the same way? And, you know, it's funny looking back now, you're like, man, we were kind of the OGs of this stuff because the technologies didn't exist back then.
Hmm.
I used to get back page subpoenas on a CD and I would print them off. And I remember sitting at one Christmas at my ex-in-laws with I think it was two of the 3-inch binders that were just ad after ad that I had printed off. It was hundreds of ads, and I would just sit there and draw out a timeline, literally with pen and colored highlighters, so that I knew which girl was which. And then eventually some of the technology came around and caught up, and it sped that process up. But yeah, I mean, investigatively, we just really started kind of working it like a murder.
Wow. That's really interesting. And to go off of that, a lot of people think that human trafficking has always been aimed at, preventing that and not criminalizing them.
Yeah.
So branching off of that, are there any misconceptions that the public has regarding human trafficking, and what are key things that you think our listeners and anyone else should take away from this and learn from this topic?
Yeah. I think misconceptions generally, for the public, right? They tend to be that prostitution and human trafficking are the same thing, and they're not, right? That is caused in many ways by law enforcement because you still see where stings happen and it's like, hey, 10 women were arrested for prostitution. We did a human trafficking operation, right? So we're feeding that to the general public. The two are not the same. They're completely different, right? And one happens to be a symptom of the other. So that's a big one is children, right? That the overwhelming majority of the people that are being trafficked are children. In the United States, domestically, when it comes to sex trafficking, that is untrue, right? So it is a focus in many ways. It's where we divert a lot of attention to. Um, and it's righteous, right? We need to protect children. We need to find child victims of trafficking. But if we focus on that, we're missing 19-year-old victims, right? We're missing 18-year-old victims. We're missing 55-year-old victims.
Mhm.
And you know, that tends to take up a lot of space in this field. Um, you know, the other misconception is that one of the biggest ones is that there's force in this, right? That there's, and I say force in the form of like kidnapping and things like that. It gets a lot of attention. I had a little social media spat with a local here in Texas that had put a comment on Facebook and like the Moms in the Know page, was like, "Hey, everybody be careful. There's trafficking at this gas station. There was a white van and these three Hispanic men that were talking to people and they're just waiting for the right one to kidnap." And I was like, this is not human trafficking. Like I was just like, this is not what we're looking for. So calm down. And it's always interesting to me because her comment will bring thousands of comments and likes and shares and whatever. And then when I'm like, hey, hold on, like everything's safe, all is well in the world, right?
Right.
Um, I'm an SOB. And it's like, actually the woman was like, well, you must be a trafficker. If you know so much and you're so worried about defending them, you must be one, right? And I'm like, no. I'm trying to educate people on what they need to be worried about, and this ain't it. It needs to be who your teenage kid is talking to after lights out on their Instagram page, not this. And it's funny too because one of the default response, I can always tell you the default response is, well, it's better to be safe than sorry, right? It's better to be safe. And I'm like, you are correct. How many fire extinguishers do you have in your home?
Right.
Right? Because
I
if we're
wouldn't, probably not
so
many.
worried, yeah, if we're so worried about being safe than sorry, I sure hope you have one in every room in your home because the house could catch on fire, right? And it's like, come on, man. Um, those tend to be the biggest misconceptions is really that, you know, it's all children and they're being kidnapped.
Right. And I was going to highlight that. You think of kidnapping victims and you even think of human trafficking victims, and 99% of the time you're going to go towards the younger demographic of,
You are.
below the age of 12. And a lot of the times, like you said, you forget about the people that are, in their 50s or in their 40s.
Yeah.
Just because it has kidnapping or things like that, it's a whole branch of people that are affected by it. And I studied that in a criminology course in my undergraduate studies. And it kind of opened my eyes, like, every TV show you see or movie. I think there was one that recently came out of a movie, and it was pretty popular, and it was all focused on kids, not necessarily
Yeah.
adult.
Well, and I get it to a degree, right? Kids grab people's hearts, and when they grab your hearts, they grab your donor money is what they grab. Um, it, the part of the thing is too, can I deny that stranger abduction happens in the United States? No, it happens, right? A true stranger abduction happens at such a statistically small rate in the United States that like that's not my big worry,
Hmm.
and even, when we talk about abductions, um, every kid should be at home with the parent that they should be at home with, right? But
Hmm.
there's a very, very big difference between a non-custodial parent not returning a child or a non-custodial parental kidnapping than a stranger abduction, right? A stranger abduction does not usually end well, right? Like they're not kidnapping you to hang out and take you to Disney.
Right.
Usually, a non-custodial parent is probably a parent who somewhere deep inside really wants to be a good person and just ain't, right? Like doesn't necessarily mean harm to the child. And that's just such an interesting, especially as it comes to sex trafficking, it's such an interesting overlap. Um, the minute amount of times that it happens.
Right. And you also mentioned that it's not necessarily the people at the gas station that you should be worried about. It's rather who is your child talking to or who is your friend talking to when
Yeah.
late at night on a social media platform. So I kind of wanted to know, like, how do you feel that the role of technology and even social media has affected the issue of human trafficking? Has it also affected the fight against it? Um, yeah.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, right? So traffickers, it's like a trifecta, right? So you have these young ladies that chances are I can tell you most things about somebody's life, especially a young person, right? If I follow their social media.
Mhm.
So I'm going to know problems they're having with mom and dad. I'm going to know financial issues. I'm going to know if they're a college student and they're having financial problems. I'm going to be able to find out a lot. Well, traffickers obviously exploit that, right? They watch for that because they're looking for prey. They're looking for somebody who's got a crappy relationship with their parents, who's doesn't have a support system, who's in financial instability, right? And they're going to show up and talk about how wonderful they are. Um, Most of our trafficking victims and survivors that we come in contact with, a large majority will tell you that they met their trafficker um, through social media, if it's somebody that they already didn't know, things like that. So the recruitment process is there. The beauty of that is a lot of traffickers, not all, but a lot, like to show off, right? Because it's an excellent recruitment tool. If I know that you're having economic instability issues and I show you pictures of my Mercedes SUV and I'm always covered in cash and I'm out going and having dinner at some of the nicest places, I now become really appealing to you, right? For the financial stability that I'm going to promise you. Um, so that's where we see a lot of the overlap. It does make it easier for the targeting, on behalf of the traffickers, right?
Hmm.
That being said, it also, to their demise, makes targeting them really easy because once I can figure out who you are, there's a very good chance you're going to do a lot of really dumb things on social media that are going to connect me to you as a trafficker, right? And build a lot of really good evidence against you um in your trafficking case. So yeah, it's affected it massively in the sense that it affords the recruitment,
Hmm.
um the initial connection a lot for traffickers and victims, but it does help to provide us something to exploit for operational purposes and investigative purposes um as investigators as well.
Yeah. Um, Going off of that too, just to kind of get the background and the better understanding for everyone. Can you kind of explain how you go from, hearing about a victim of human trafficking and like how do you and your team work to rescue them and ensure their safety, especially for the long term on the safety aspects?
Yeah, that can be such a difficult process, and I think that's where a lot of law enforcement and even service providers, frankly, get tired.
Hmm.
And it's where the burnout comes, I think. We use the term rescue. I always say identify a victim of human trafficking because really when we get down to like who's going to rescue this person, it really is themselves. We just have to provide such a strong environment for them to do that, that they're able to do it, through their own uh, hard work.
Hmm.
Um, when it comes to what that looks like, for me, particularly as in a law enforcement capacity, it is I need to remove this trafficker from your life, right? You cannot get help with this knucklehead breathing in your ear. It doesn't work that way, right? I am at battle with him, because one of us has to show ultimately that we can provide you a better outcome for yourself. And I've got to be able to prove that that's what I'm able to do, right? So for me, building the case, having the trafficker get locked up and taken into custody and held, right, is the other big thing. Um, that's where kind of my side of the fight comes in when it comes to the service provider, right? When it comes to it really depends. We have a lot of people that are like, well-meaning, right? Organizations that are like, oh my gosh, we're here to help. We're gonna, provide them with food. Well, not all domestic trafficking victims are starving. They're just
Hmm.
simply not, right? They're not, food is not being withheld. So, the can of green beans is great in theory,
Hmm.
but if the trafficker's dropping her off to pick up the green beans, it doesn't do anybody any good. We see a lot of will provide housing, long-term housing. Long-term housing is great, but if she's running, really 72 hours is about what you got. So it really when people talk about a marathon and not a sprint, that's trafficking, right? I've got to be there for um this victim today and next week.
Hmm.
And then, and that's where, particularly for law enforcement, I had a partner that he was like, nah, man, like I'll give her the benefit of the doubt this time, but next time, like she goes to jail. And it took a while for me to overcome that with him because I was like, just because she's not asking you for help doesn't mean she doesn't need it, right? And it doesn't change this game. And one of the things that I think is difficult for particularly law enforcement to understand, but some service providers, this is the only facet of law enforcement where we are the ones that dictate to the victim when we will interact, right? So if you think about it, any other victim of crime calls 911, and we'll use domestic violence as an example, right? The domestic violence victim who's
Hmm.
actively getting beat on will call 911 and be like, I need help right now. He's killing me. And here come the cops. And maybe by the time the cops leave, she's already in the mode where she's like, oh, I don't want him to go to jail. I love him,
Hmm.
right? But she has called us. When it comes to doing an operation targeting a trafficking victim, they're not asking for help. They're not asking for anything. They're not calling the police. They're not wanting to cooperate. And we're the ones that are dictating that. So we have to understand that in doing that, I'm dealing with you at a point where you're in the middle of fight or flight. You're dealing with complex trauma and PTSD. And now I'm the one who's decided for this interaction to occur, not you,
Hmm.
right? So chances are it's not going to be a positive one. And that's okay.
Right.
Right. So kind of having those like interaction after interaction after interaction after interaction is what is ultimately going to lead to recovery, rescue. That was a very long answer for that question.
That's okay. Um, I mean, like you said, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. So kind of going off of that, do you think that the prior criminalization of their acts in the past is kind of what led to that extreme divide between I need to ask for help, or are there other factors that have led to that?
It definitely helps it, right? So, you have a trafficker who's trafficking this woman and he tells her, "Hey, if the cops come along, just tell them you're a prostitute. You have nothing, no, I'm not here. I'll bond you out of jail. We'll go on with life as normal. Rinse, wash, repeat, no biggie." And then she comes walking into a sting and is like, "Hey, I'm not being trafficked." And then we lock her up. We just made the trafficker the truth teller and all this, right?
Mhm.
I had a young lady recently that in the interview, she was like, she said a very cop thing. She said, "Yeah, the last guy that we came across, saw the bad guy's record, saw my record, and started fishing because he thought he had something." And I told her, I was like, "Well, he didn't think he had something. He knew he had something. He just didn't know what it was, and he didn't know how to get there. I'm not fishing." I was like, "Let me tell you your story, right?" And you kind of watch, she had this weird body reaction I've never seen before. And I could tell, like, I was spot on because she had a very obvious reaction.
Mhm.
So I think the criminalization, it does, it confirms what the trafficker has told them, and it makes the trafficker the truth teller, right?
Right.
But then when you look at it, it's got to be interesting in a not a positive way for trafficking victims, right? Because when when you stop and think about it, and I challenge law enforcement all the time, is just give me five, right? Five is not that many, or three. Three laws in any penal code or the US code where the victim of the crime is arrested. Just three. And they can't. I had one person throw like murder out one time. I was like, "What?" Um, but they can't because it doesn't happen. So you
Mhm.
have to look at this and be like, "Look, I'm being victimized by this person, and I'm being victimized by the system
Right.
that says that it's here to help me. You're not helping me, right? You say that, but you're not."
Right.
And it has to create that pushback. There's no way it wouldn't, right? So yeah, I think the criminalization is very, very harmful for a multitude of reasons.
Yeah, it's still so interesting to see how that even came about. I know it's a totally different thing, like you said, compared to murder or,
Yeah.
any other like arson even.
Yeah.
It's so complex and so individual that I think that's probably why it just kind of fell through those seams in such an awful way.
Yeah.
That's what's led to all of this happening. And you mentioned, various laws that we have in place. And I saw where you were able to create some laws that have focused on human trafficking. And I just wanted you to maybe describe a couple of them, and just how do you think that we can take current laws too and adapt them to ensure that they are no longer a burden for victims?
Yeah. I've had the opportunity to be a small part of the creation of Maine, right? And a couple of the ones that I think have been the best, right? That I think are really moving the needle. One was for the state of Texas to make it a felony to purchase sex, right? So we became the first state where it was a felony to be a solicitor, to be a sex buyer. Um, that took a couple sessions. There was a lot of pushback on that for a while. A lot of different movements really weren't fans of it. Um, it has in many ways really changed the landscape in Texas. There were buyers that were like, "Hey, I'm not doing this anymore. Effective September 1st, I'm not a part of this anymore. I cannot fade a felony." There were some where on the review boards where everybody's chit-chatting, right? And all the discussions are going, they would be like, "Hey, like I don't want to work at McDonald's for the rest of my life. Like I'm not going to catch a felony for this. So I'm done."
Hmm.
Um, that was important because it also incentivized law enforcement to go after purchasers versus sellers, right? So I could arrest a woman for prostitution for this like lowest level misdemeanor possible, or I can arrest the other side of the coin for a felony, right? Why not go for the felony? Depending on state laws here in Texas, as an example, if you drive up in a vehicle that it's subject to asset forfeiture. Like you used that to commit the offense. So now you have law enforcement that's like seeing felony criminal cases. They're having um, a forfeiture of vehicles and things like that that's happening as a result. It kind of incentivized them to target buyers. So that's really important. One that I mean, it went into law like a month ago was to provide an affirmative defense to prosecution for victims of trafficking for offenses that they've been arrested for. So that one we haven't seen results from yet because it literally was like a month ago. Um, that one's going to be really important because these women that are being trafficked, that are being criminalized, it's going to provide them with the affirmative defense to that. Along throughout some of the others were just like, different bond deals where they could judges could put higher bonds, they could put protective orders, things like that. Um, just to really protect victims, but then also to give law enforcement tools, right? If you're violating a protective order, you're going to get arrested for that period. So if that protective order is in place, it's one more tool law enforcement has to arrest the trafficker if need be, again, for violating that. So yeah,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I studied pre-law as my concentration in undergrad,
yeah.
working towards going to law school soon.
Nice.
So just the law aspect of that was really interesting to me, and so I'm glad to have heard more about it.
It
Um,
is.
to close this out, what is one lesson from your career that you could provide our audience with, and explain how it's really changed the way you think about justice for victims and human trafficking overall? I know it's a heavy hitter,
Um,
so.
it is. It is. So I wouldn't say any particular case by any stretch, but one thing I've learned is, it's funny when, especially with young cops, you hear from time to time, I don't make the law, I just enforce it, right? And that is a very, very dangerous mentality,
Mhm.
across the board. And I was guilty of it, especially as a young cop, man, it was black and white. The book says, therefore, you go to jail. And one of the things we have to remember, particularly in trafficking, but I think across the board, is that jail oftentimes doesn't solve a problem, right? It can create problems. It can create bigger problems. We use trafficking as an example. If we're criminalizing victims of trafficking, we're putting them under restriction of probation, parole, things like that. We are um, putting them in positions where they have to pay for attorneys, they have to pay for bond, they have to do all these things. Who's doing that? The trafficker is. Who do they now owe money to? The trafficker, right? So we're creating this financial vulnerability. We're creating this financial uh, bond, really. And we're putting them in jail, as the trafficker said, which means we're making the trafficker the truth teller, which then in turn So I think one of the things that people have to really understand in it trafficking really opened my eyes to the fact that with the law, every action has an equal and opposite reaction, right? Um, you, you see this from time to time when people talk about, years ago hunting terrorists, right? I just killed this terrorist as a bad guy, but his two kids just watched. Did I just create two more in this vacuum, right? And it really, again, just because something is black and white in the law, it doesn't mean it is the right thing. It doesn't mean that it is what needs to shape our investigations. Um, you know, can we let our victim go today in order to arrest the trafficker? Of course we can. Is that black and white? It's not. Um, so I think understanding that the world, particularly here, but even in a large portion of law enforcement, has a lot of gray space,
Hmm.
right? It's not black and white. It's the very, very small amount black and a very, very small amount white, right? It's all gray. So I think for me, the biggest thing has been I've had to reevaluate um, where I believe impact comes from, right? It doesn't always come from handcuffs. You know, is I remember a case and I had some narcotics guys that were pretty irritated with me. Um, we knew that this woman had heroin. And I was like, I'm not charging her and I'm not digging because she's saying that tomorrow, and she was being trafficked, right? Tomorrow she will go to rehab with these people, right? So if we can just buy 12 hours, just let her go, and the narcotics guys that were there had a huge issue with it because it's like, well, she had heroin, like she needs to go to jail. That's how this works. And she ultimately went to rehab, right? She did show up and she did go to rehab, but it was like in this 12-hour period, what happens when she becomes dope sick, right? She's going to get dope sick. He's going to put her out and make her work to be able to get dope, to be able to do this. So she's going to be being trafficked for the next 12 hours. What is the big picture? And it's not always black and white, it can be hard. So, yeah, again, that I think is the biggest kind of takeaway that I've learned over the years.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially in certain careers, like you said. I feel like a lot of people see the world as black and white. You do one thing, well, this is the other side of what happens if you do or don't. And that's it.
Yeah,
Well, no, if you kind of like take a step back and look at the whole situation, like you said, the 12 hours, what really is going to happen in 12 hours that hasn't already happened in 72 plus?
exactly.
So having that mentality is really important, and I agree. Especially someone who's wanting to go into the legal field, it's always, well, you do this, well, here's what's going to happen.
Yeah, and there's plenty that there's punishment, right? There needs to
Right.
like we have to have prisons. I
Right.
don't want to take away from this. There are a lot of people that need to be in prison.
Yeah.
Um, and there are times where it's like, hey, like you need to be punished for this crime, right? No doubt. Um, but even addiction, right? Why don't we treat the underlying factor?
Hmm.
Maybe we can put an end to the addiction. I
Right.
know a lot of people that go to prison for years get out, and the first thing they do is go find
Go back.
crack,
Right.
right? Like, maybe we can fix the problem.
Right. I was fortunate to have had an internship where my coordinator was, he would tell me, an easy solution is just put him in jail. But why would I do that? Because I know exactly like he does every single other time in his past, he's going to go right back to doing what he does. So why don't we try
Yeah.
instead of just continuously putting him through the cycle?
Well, and it's funny too because when you look at it, you're like, I hear law enforcement a lot. It's like, well, it's going to be a deterrent, and I'm like,
But it's probably
if
not.
if the 5-year sentence the last 6 times was not a deterrent, Number seven is not going to be the deterrent,
Right.
right? Like what you're doing is not deterring anything. Um, what are we doing to solve this issue? And I that's that's such a big answer. It can't fall on cops, right? It can't fall on a single prosecutor. It can't fall on a single defense attorney. It's got to fall on
The person.
society and the system as a whole. But I think most issues are a lot more complicated than what we try to make them.
Right. Or sometimes they're not as complicated as we try to
True.
make them.
Yeah, yeah, true.
But yeah, well, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me and
Yeah.
speak with us here at the N Network. And we look forward to speaking in the future.
Thanks.
Yeah.